Imagine you're able to send a thought, not just a text, but a thought to a different mind. We are actually much closer to this than you might think. But before we get into this, I want to begin by debunking one of the most widely spread myths in neuroscience. We've all seen the movie Lucy, where a woman accidentally ingests a drug which helps her take control of the full capacity of her brain. Well, this idea is based on the very popular in pop culture myth that we only use 10% of our brain. Is there any truth to that? Specifically, any neuroscientific truth to that? Is there 90% that is just laying dormant, waiting for us to unlock it so we can access supernatural powers like telepathy or telekinesis? In this video, I want to explore this myth, why it is not true, it is not scientific, but also where it came from, why I think it's such a popular and powerful idea, and why it has existed for such a long time. But most interestingly, I also want to discuss how we really can achieve telepathy and telekinesis. Okay, so there are three main arguments that I'm going to explore in debunking this myth. The first one is the argument from evolution. The second one is the argument from brain imaging studies. And the third one is the one from neurological damage. So the argument from evolution is quite simple. Have you heard of the expression use it or lose it? Well, that very much applies here. The human brain makes up about 2% of our body mass. However, the energy that it consumes is about 20% of our body's energy. That is a huge amount of energy. This energy is used not just for you to do any daily activities, but also just to literally maintain you being alive, to maintain you being awake, to maintain you sleeping, to maintain you breathing, to maintain all of the functions that keep you alive. Maintaining tissue, especially brain tissue, is metabolically expensive. In an environment where our ancestors had to literally fight for their life, for a bit of calorie, a bit of energy in order to sustain their bodies and stay alive, it will be incredibly economically unsustainable to spend that energy to evolve and sustain an organ, 90% of which is unusable. That throughout our evolution, those hundreds of thousands of years, for our brains to have wasted so much energy on a part of an important organ that just stays dormant, it just makes no sense. If a structure no longer provides a means to survival or reproduction, it is less likely to be selected for. Which means that even if there ever was a supernatural part of our brain, which I would very, very highly doubt, it would have been selected against, because it would not be economically smart or evolutionary advantageous to spend so much energy on something that does nothing and just sits there and waits for it to be switched on hundreds of thousands of years later. The second argument that I want to bring to your attention is the one that comes from looking at brain imaging studies. For example, we have things like fMRIs and PET scans, which can show us the structure and also the metabolic and blood flow activity throughout the brain. If you look at these images, you are going to see activity throughout pretty much the whole brain. Even when someone is doing some very basic, easy tasks like daydreaming or zoning out or sleeping. Yes, different brain areas are more active during certain tasks, but there is no one brain area that just sits there dark or blank, dormant, not doing anything, waiting to be unlocked at some point. And thirdly, there is the argument that comes from looking at people who have had neurological damage. If there was a part of the brain that was not used, it could be argued that a person can lose that part of their brain without having any noticeable effect whatsoever. However, the reality is that damage to any part of the brain, no matter how small it is, usually leads to noticeable deficits in things like speech, movements, emotion, and memory. And some of you are going to think, well, I've heard of this or that case where someone lost a part of their brain and they still function relatively well and normally. And that is true. However, that is thanks to neuroplasticity. That is because after trauma, the brain can reorganize itself and assign that missing function, it can assign it to a different region. So yes, people can lose parts of their brain and function well. However, that is thanks to neuroplasticity, not because the part that they lost had no function whatsoever. Okay, so now that we've debunked the myth, we've looked at three different arguments as to why that myth is wrong and unscientific. Now that we've done that, I want to share with you my idea of why I think that myth even exists in the first place, why I think it's a real scientific idea that has been completely misunderstood and misconstrued by popular culture, and why I think it still persists to this day and is so powerful. Obviously, this is just my own personal thoughts. This is purely speculative. There's no way to prove it, but it's just what makes sense to me. So in the beginning of the 20th century, there was a really big shift in psychology into understanding the power of the unconscious. One name that comes to mind is, of course, Sigmund Freud. Freud is not the only one who advocated this, but he is one of the pioneers. So to give you some context, there are a lot of people who believe that the human psyche is purely a result of stimuli. Everything that we might suffer psychologically is just a result of our environment. Everything can be explained through our environment. So when Freud came along and he started talking about the unconscious, that was a huge shift in the whole philosophy of psychoanalysis. Because he's not saying that we are just a result of our environment. He's saying we are not even aware of what is going on in our heads. There are unconscious stimuli in your head, and you're aware of only a tiny fraction of them. That is a incredibly influential and important idea. I would argue it's one of Freud's most important, if not his most important idea, most influential idea. And it's also the idea based on which a lot of modern talking therapies are based off of. Modern therapies to this day try and unravel things from our unconsciousness to bring them into the conscious so they can be worked upon, so we can understand our triggers and etc. This idea is revolutionary. And the way that Freud illustrated his idea of what the unconscious is with the image of an iceberg. This is obviously just an illustration, it's just a metaphor, but it's a very good one. It's the idea that everything below the iceberg is the 90% of everything that we are not aware of. All of the triggers and stimuli in our brains that we have no access to. And the part of the iceberg that is above the water represents the tiny fraction, the 10% of our conscious experience, what we actually experience in terms of our thoughts, in terms of what we are aware of. What I think happened is that people just widely misconstrued and or misunderstood his idea. I think because Freud obviously became quite popular, I think that idea and that image of an iceberg, or just the metaphorical representations of conscious versus subconscious, made its way into pop culture, and the lay people somehow understood it to also represent anatomy. I think people took a metaphor, which is quite true, about us being conscious of a fraction of the processes that happen in our brain. I think people took that and just thought that it also represents what we use and what we don't use, as if the 10% that we are aware of is what we use, and the 90% that we are not aware of we don't use is just lays dormant, which is not true. It is not what Freud meant by it, but I do think they took his metaphor and understood it to reflect anatomy. This is my speculation as to why that happened, and once it had made its way into pop culture, I think the reason it's so powerful is that it just flatters us. I think we like the idea of this huge potential, powerful thing, untapped thing in our heads that we are at the verge of tapping into. It makes us feel special. It makes us feel different from other animals. However, the reality is that there's no reason to assume that we are any different. Okay, so now that we've explored why this myth is not true and why I think it came to be, now we can get to the really interesting bit of this video, which is how I think we actually can tap into telepathy and telekinesis. I do believe there is room for expansion. The caveat is, this expansion is not organic. It's technological. We are not going to access things like telepathy by meditating on it or taking something that enhances our biological predisposition, because this doesn't exist. One brain cannot wirelessly communicate with another brain in a different country. However, if the brain had a chip installed in it, and that chip can wirelessly connect to a chip in another brain, you have effectively achieve telepathy. And no, this is not science fiction. This is something that has actually been happening for a while, and something that is going to, in my opinion, expand like crazy in the following years. I'll give you an example. So we have two rats. Within the brain of each rat, we implant an electrode. One of them has to be trained to make a decision. It's a sensory decision about pressing a lever. The neural signal from this rat is transmitted in the form of brain stimulation to the second rat. And now the second rat makes the exact same decision, even though it was never trained to do so. Even more interestingly, something similar has already been done with humans, and it was done in a non-invasive way. This means that there was no chip implanted in their brain. So in this experiment, there are two people wearing EEG caps. So the EEG caps are recording the electrical activity that goes across the scalp. And there was a third person who was receiving these signals in the form of pulses, in the form of TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation. So what they had to do was they just had to play a game of Tetris. So the two people sending the signals had to make a a decision, and then the third person receiving the signals had to receive that decision and make it without actually seeing the Tetris game. So he just had to feel the decision that he had to make. He had to receive the decision from the senders and feel the decision that he had to make. And they were successful. So in practice, you literally had decisions traveling wirelessly from brain to brain. Now that we looked at actual telepathy, let's look at actual telekinesis. Telekinesis means moving things with your mind. We are already doing this as well. There are implants which can be implanted into a human's brain and can decode the neural signals from the neurons, and then they can translate these signals into commands which can then control computers or robotic arms. This way, people, for example, with paralysis can move not just cursors in a computer, but literal robotic arms. And I'm not even talking about limbs, artificial limbs that are attached to them. I mean fully external objects, just by thinking, just with the power of their thoughts. And again, similar things are being experimented on and tested non-invasively, meaning with EEGs as well. In other words, all the supernatural powers that we dream of, that we see in movies like telepathy and telekinesis, they are possible and they're happening. In conclusion, the idea that we only use 10% of our brains is wrong. It is scientifically inaccurate, and it has been debunked time after time by different arguments from different perspectives. It is just not true. I think the reason that it exists in the first place is because early psychoanalytic ideas were widely misconstrued and misunderstood by the public. However, I do think that superpowers, superhuman powers can be possible by extending our brains into technology. So no, we don't only use 10% of our brains, we use 100. And by doing so, we have already linked machines to brains and brains to brains. And if this is what we can achieve when we use 100% of our brains, you can only imagine what we can do when we start networking them.